Now, a look into ethics. So, ethics are a consideration in all areas of life, but also particularly in statistical experiments. So, statistical fraud is a thing that can happen, or often you'll see this referred to as data fraud. If you search for data fraud online, there are all sorts of examples of people coming up with, false data and passing it off as real. Um, the main two areas where we, see data fraud. This is in the fabrication of results, misrepresentation of results, or falsification. So fabrication and falsification are very similar. Oops, falsification. Um, Fabrication is making things up. So, like coming up with numbers that weren't really there. Falsification is a word for lying. So, that would be like lying about the numbers that they got or changing them somehow. And the book has some examples of one researcher in particular who was kind of notorious for fraud. So a lot of these examples come from that case study. But some examples of statistical or data fraud would be things like creating data sets. All right, ones that look nice for the results that you want to get. If they just make up numbers, okay, that's fraud. Altering data. So if there's a number that, a researcher doesn't like and they just go in there and say, I'm going to change this 5 to a 1. Alterations like that that can, impact the results, that is fraud. You could do things like misrepresent how many subjects you're looking at. Okay. We discussed briefly how sample size can affect the reliability of results. Larger sample sizes are better than smaller ones. So if someone does a study on a small number of subjects and says, oh, this was on a big group, yeah, that would be a case of fraud. And then the other one is in manipulating different equipments in the study or certain processes to their advantage. Okay, so manipulating equipment or processes, maybe they tweak with the scale, like get in there and unscrew something so that it doesn't work entirely correctly. If that's done on purpose, that's fraud. And all of these, it does come down to intent. If the intent is to change the outcome, change the data, um, that's what makes it fraudulent. If, like, with the case of altering data, if someone intentionally says, this number is a 5, I don't like that, I'm going to write down a 1 so it makes my results look better. That's altering data with the intent to commit fraud. That is intending to cheat on there. That's in contrast to, oh, this number is a 5 and I accidentally wrote down a 1. That's a case of non-sampling error that we've discussed before. But that's not fraudulent per se. That's just an accident. So when we're looking at things like this, and especially if any of this goes to trial, like a fraud case, you really have to look at the intent behind what was going on there. Was the intent to alter the results, or was there no malicious intent here? Was it just a mistake? Okay, so that's a little bit on data fraud. The other big thing is looking at safety of participants, especially when we're using human participants. You've got to take safety into consideration big time. The Department of Health and Human Services is the federal regulator of human studies. So they have all the big overarching guidelines if you want to look them up. Then at a somewhat smaller level at universities and research institutions, you have an institutional review board, and they go through and evaluate from time to time the safety and validity of the research processes that are being done. So with each new study, the review board will go in, look at it, make sure things are on the up and up. And if it's okay, the researchers can proceed. And they'll check back in to make sure that the participants are being taken care of. All right, so some key protections for particularly human subjects. The risks must be minimized and reasonable with respect to benefits. So no huge risks for only potentially a tiny reward. We don't want to put people's lives at risk. First of all, do no harm. So there might be some risks in the experiment, but they need to have a large benefit if you're going to present a risk there. And then that also really ties into this next idea. Participants must give informed consent. This is huge. Okay, anyone participating in the study needs to have the risks clearly explained. Okay, and they must consent in writing. And as a researcher, you need to keep documentation of that consent. Okay, people need to know what they're getting into, and they need to know what the risks and benefits are going to be. And then lastly, data collected from individuals must be guarded carefully to protect their privacy. That goes in general for a lot of fields. Medical records have HIPAA, Health Information Protection something Act. At the schools here, we have FERPA for educational records protection. So yeah, we need to keep a guard on people's information. But these are some things to keep in mind to make sure your study is as safe and ethical as possible.